Good morning. Welcome to our Sunday School Bible Study time at Southwest Park Baptist Church. We continue in our study in the book of Proverbs. This week our lesson is entitled Compassion Demonstrated. The biblical truth, following God's wisdom, is demonstrated in how a person treats others. We are going to finish up the third chapter of Proverbs this week, verses 13 through 35. The first section of that, verses 13 through 18, are a poem written in praise of wisdom. So listen to what Solomon says here with this poem in verses 13 through 18. Happy is the man who finds wisdom, and the man who gains understanding. For her proceeds are better than the profits of silver, her gain than fine gold. She is more precious than rubies, and all the things you may desire cannot compare with her. Length of days is in her right hand, in her left hand riches and honor. Her ways are ways of pleasantness, and all her paths are peace. She is a tree of life to those who take hold of her, and happy are all who retain her. In the beginning verse, verse 13, and the ending verse of that poem, we find the word happy or blessed in some of your translations there. The ancient Hebrew language had two words that could be translated into English as blessed. One consistently refers to God's activity toward his creation, including us as human beings. You'll see that word when we get down to verse 33. The other word, the one that's used here, refers to the result in people's lives. Living in godly wisdom results in a happy or blessed life. Warren Wiersbe says about this, some people know the price of everything, but the value of nothing. Consequently, they make unwise choices and end up with shoddy merchandise. An acquaintance of mine, he says, thinking he was getting a bargain, bought a box of white shirts from a street vendor for just a few dollars. When he got home and opened the box, he discovered they weren't shirts at all. They were dickies made to be used on corpses. So much for his bargain. You take what you want from life and you pay for it. I can kind of identify with that because I like a bargain. And sometimes a bargain turns out to be not a bargain. It's good to have the things money can buy, provided you don't lose the things that money can't buy. What good is an expensive house if there's no happy home within it? Happiness, pleasantness, peace aren't the guaranteed results of financial success, but they are guaranteed to the person who lives by God's wisdom. And as the psalmist, or Solomon, the writer of Proverbs here says, wisdom becomes a tree of life to the believer who takes hold of her. And that's a foretaste of heaven, as we see in Revelation 22. I read a sermon by a pastor named Larry Turner, and in his comments on these verses here, he talks about in verses 13 and 14, wisdom's more profitable than silver, wages are better than gold, more precious than rubies, and nothing you desire can compare to her. And I'm not sure when he preached this sermon, several years ago, I think, but he said the average cost for a ruby was $300 per carat. The average cost for a pound of silver, $316. The average cost for a pound of gold, more than $20,000. And he says at the time that Proverbs was written, these were the most expensive metals and gems around. But as expensive as silver is, and gold and rubies, wisdom is more good, more pleasing, and desirable for profit. If you want prosperity in your life, then look to wisdom and not finances. Wisdom will lead you to the investment for long-term profit. He goes on to say, Solomon says that the wages of wisdom are better than gold. So think about that a minute. What are wages? The dictionary defines it as money that's paid or received for work or services, as by the hour, day, or week. It's the fruit of our labors. It's our harvest. It's our crops, our produce. So what we earn by being wise is better than gold, Solomon says. There's an old story about a man in Europe who wanted to travel to the United States. In those days, the only way to get here was by ocean liner. He worked hard, saved up his money, finally bought a ticket and stuffed a year's worth of wages into an envelope. He would need those wages to get settled. Then he bought a suitcase, filled it with cheese and crackers. That would be his food for the 3-week journey. The ship set sail. Mealtime came. All the other passengers went into the large dining hall to eat their meal. The man went to his suitcase, took out some cheese and crackers. While he could smell the delicious aroma coming from the meal being served, he went to a corner and ate his cheese and crackers. After the meal, he heard some of the passengers talk about how full they were. The poor man really wanted to join the others in the dining hall, but he refused to spend his wages. Sometimes he would lay awake at night dreaming of food, but he needed the wages to get settled. On the last day of the trip, another man came up to him and said, "Sir, I can't help but notice that each time a meal is served, you go over to that corner and eat cheese and crackers. Why don't you come into the banquet hall with the rest of us?" Traveler was embarrassed, but finally he stammered out, "Well, to tell you the truth, I don't want to spend my money on meals. You see, I have a year's wages saved up, and I need this to get settled." The other passenger raised his eyebrows in surprise. He said, "Why, didn't you read the brochure when you came on board? Didn't you realize the meals are included in the price of your ticket? The meals have already been paid for." If he had read the book, if he had sought the wisdom in the book, he would not have been hungry. Wisdom is better than wages. And sadly, many of us as believers, because we don't read the book, we don't look for the wisdom, we spiritually eat cheese and crackers rather than the banquet that's provided for us. Down in verses 19 and 20, Solomon talks about the harmony with God's creation that wisdom brings. Another blessing there. He says, "The Lord by wisdom founded the earth. By understanding he established the heavens. By his knowledge the deeps were broken up and the skies drip with dew." The person who walks according to God's wisdom can truly sing, "This is my Father's world," and really mean it. The wisdom of God brought everything into being, including what science calls the laws of nature. Obey these laws, creation will work with you and for you. Disobey them, creation will work against you. So, people in this so-called New Age movement try to be at one with creation. But if they reject the wisdom of God, they're doomed to fail. Christians who live by God's wisdom will be good stewards of his creation and will use his gifts for his glory. In verses 21 through 26, we find confidence gained from living according to God's wisdom. Listen to these verses. My son, let them not vanish from your sight. Some of your translations say depart from your sight. Keep sound wisdom and discretion, so they will be life to your soul and adornment to your neck. Then you will walk in your way securely, and your foot will not stumble. When you lie down, you will not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Do not be afraid of sudden fear, nor of the onslaught of the wicked when it comes. For the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your foot from being caught. Again, in verse 21, we see this format of a parent speaking to a child, which is so common in the book of Proverbs. And when the parent there says, keep sound wisdom and discretion, some of your translations may say maintain, preserves, another word there. The picture that Solomon is drawing for us there is the idea of a faithful, alert sentry that's guarding a military installation or is keeping watch over an agricultural operation, alert to the dangers there that may lurk outside. He uses two terms there that he says we're to keep alert for. The first is sound wisdom. That's a technical term that describes the good judgment that leads to practical success in life. The other term, discretion, describes an ability to formulate and execute a wise course of action in any kind of situation. So wisdom gives us insight into God's way of living, and discretion nourishes the good sense and sound judgment that allows us to live the way God wants us to. Let them not vanish from your sight, or let them not depart from your sight, means don't lose sight of them. The picture that we get, overall picture in this verse here, is of a believer constantly on the alert to the need to use sound judgment and godly wisdom to deal with the situations of life. Verse 22 tells us the result of that kind of vigilance. Literally, he says, this will be life to your soul. The very essence of who you are. This kind of action and lifestyle will preserve you. It'll preserve your life. The second phrase, referring to the adornment to your neck here, describes the same kind of result, only with an external kind of reality. The emphasis there is on what the world can see. So keeping sound wisdom and discretion will preserve your life, both internally, the essence of who you are, the soul, and externally there, an adornment to your neck, as he says. Verse 23 says, then you will walk in your way securely, and your foot will not stumble. So in this verse, Solomon compares acquiring wisdom to the imagery of walking with God. Walking is a method of moving from one place to another. So when he talks about walking in your way, it's a way of describing our progression in this human life. And Solomon says that the one who walks in godly wisdom walks safely or securely. And he further says that they will not stumble. Now, that doesn't mean that the one who walks in wisdom will never have any problems, will never encounter any trouble in their life, will never falter. But what it does mean is that they forever rest securely in their relationship with God. And because of their lifestyle, because of their walking in godly wisdom, they will avoid many of the pitfalls of life. In verse 24, he says, when you lie down, you'll not be afraid. When you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. People instinctively understand that they're more vulnerable to danger when they're asleep. And so people frequently have a hard time going to sleep, sleeping, because of worries or anxiety or any number of things. Believers who trust in God and live in His wisdom and grace can face the vulnerabilities of life and the vulnerability of sleep with confidence. They can overcome their fears, and as the psalmist describes it here, enjoy a sweet, pleasant sleep. God is watching over them, and they're secure in His care. Verse 25, he says, do not be afraid of sudden fear, nor of the onslaught, or literally the storm of the wicked when it comes. Solomon specifically encourages believers here not to fear sudden danger or the ruin of the wicked. God's people have been warned about the judgment coming. And the wicked that Solomon refers to here are those who have rejected the Lord and have determined to follow their own path. Wisdom shows that this leads to sudden danger and ruin. But thankfully, the believer who trusts God and follows Him has no reason to fear, because they will not suffer the calamity of those who reject the Lord. Vance Havner said, if I could stand for 5 minutes at God's vantage point and see the entire scheme of things as He sees it, how absurd would be my dreads, how ridiculous my fears and tears. So Solomon says, don't be afraid of sudden fear or the wicked judgment that they're going to experience. Verse 26, he follows up on that. For the Lord will be your confidence. More literally, the Lord will be at your side and will keep your foot from being caught. Our confidence is in the Lord. And that confidence comes from the knowledge that His presence, protection, and sustaining grace are always with us. We can face the challenges of life confidently because we know that He's always with us. A natural result of this kind of strong faith relationship with God is an increased awareness of others. And as we go into this next section, verses 27 through 30, we're going to see that and see how that plays out in our lives. So let's read verses 27 through 30. Kindness expressed. Do not withhold good from those to whom it's due, when it's in your power to do it. Do not say to your neighbor, go and come back, and tomorrow I will give it to you, when you have it with you. Do not devise harm against your neighbor while he lives securely beside you. Do not contend with a man without cause if he has done you no harm. These verses present a series of instruction regarding neighborliness. And the instructions are stated negatively. It's kind of interesting. In fact, in the original, each verse begins, do not. When you think about it, a negative command sometimes is clearer than a positive command. If you're speaking to a small child, which is clearer? I want you to stay in the yard, or do not go into the street. Sometimes the negative emphasizes the danger. Bible scholars understand verse 27 in one of two ways. Literally it reads, do not withhold good from its owners. In other words, pay your obligations. In that day that Solomon was writing, a laborer was paid daily, and he needed the money to buy food for that day or the next. So, if a man has worked for us, then we owe him the money. The other way that Bible scholars understand this passage is to not withhold help or good from a needy person when we have the means to meet that need. It teaches the general idea of being generous with our neighbor. Either way, we're encouraged to not fail in doing good to others. We're to be helpful to people in need. In Galatians 6:10, Paul said, as we have opportunity, let us do good unto all men, especially unto them who are of the household of faith. I grew up in a farming community, an area of small farms. So I saw this neighborliness play out in the lives there in that community. It was commonplace there for neighbors to help each other as the needs arose, as crops needed to be planted or harvested, hay needed to be put up. Neighbors would gather to help, understanding that when the time came that they needed help, those neighbors would be there to help them as well. So there's a great sense of security in knowing that your neighbors are there ready and willing to help. And there's also a great sense of satisfaction in being able to help your neighbor be successful. Sometimes that help rose to extraordinary efforts. In one instance, a dairy farmer in our community had his barn burned. The damage was severe enough that it destroyed his ability to milk his cows, and they needed to be milked. So the men in the community gathered, and by evening of that day, they had constructed a temporary facility that allowed him to milk his cows. A good example of being good neighbors and not withholding good to those whom due when it's in your power to do it. The injunction also may be there to kind of warn the righteous against becoming so preoccupied with their proper relationship with God that they neglect their responsibility to their fellow man. James 4:17 says, therefore, to the one who knows to do good and does not do it, to him it is sin. There's an old saying that some people are so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good. So we need to be careful that we're able and willing to use the resources God's given us to do good for those around us. In verse 28, Solomon stresses doing good to others immediately. The emphasis is not just on immediately meeting the need, but the injustice when we can do something and we don't. Do not say to your neighbor, go and come back and tomorrow I'll give it to you, when you have the means right then. In Luke 10, we're all familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan. The priest and the scribe there were condemned, and they were condemned not just because they didn't help, but they didn't help the critical need in the moment there. William Penn said, I expect to pass through this life but once. If, therefore, there be any kindness I can show, any good thing I can do to any fellow human being, let me do it now and not defer or neglect it, as I shall not pass this way again. So our attitude when we see those opportunities is that that's an opportunity to be kind, to do good, to show God's love. And those opportunities will pass, and they may not come around again. In verse 29, he says, don't plot harm against your neighbor while he lives securely beside you. A wise person not only looks for opportunities to do good, but they also don't plan intentionally to do evil. The word plot there literally means to plow, and so it draws a picture of a farmer orderly and carefully plowing his field into furrows. It's an intentional kind of thing. So he's calling us here to be people of peace, to act maliciously toward our neighbor breaks the trust that he has placed in us. In order to be neighborly, we have to trust each other. It's a double wrong, the evil act itself and the breach of trust that it involves. This section of God's Word makes it very clear that we're not to take advantage of our neighbors. We're not to plot harm for the trusting neighbor. Plotting harm is the opposite of doing good. It means to manipulate, use, hurt, harm, or burden our neighbor. To do good means that we're relating to others in ways that works to their advantage. To plot harm means that we're trying to take advantage of others in some way. Some examples, and this came from a sermon by a preacher named Ed Sassnett. He said, for the Christian business person, it means that you don't sell someone products that they don't really need. It means you don't sell inferior products that you know won't last. It means that when a storm hits or a natural disaster strikes, that you don't jack up the prices to take advantage of those who are hurting. For those who live in a neighborhood, it means that I don't take advantage of my generous neighbor who will let me use his tools and then I don't return them, or I return them broken. It means if I borrow my neighbor's truck, I return it full of gas, even if it was half empty when I borrowed it. For the young athlete, it means you don't try to disadvantage someone who's competing for the same position as you are just so you can play more. You see, this is just really good, practical advice. Unfortunately, good advice that isn't taught so much today. So do not devise harm against your neighbor while he trusts you and lives securely beside you. Verse 30, do not contend with a man without cause if he has done you no harm. Many of the commentators that I read on this verse made reference to two Old Testament passages. In 1 Kings 21, Ahab, king of Israel, wanted Naboth's vineyard, but he couldn't get it. So his wife Jezebel hatched a wicked plot to have Naboth killed so that Ahab could get the vineyard. Generations later, we read in the 5th chapter of Esther how Haman wanted to get rid of godly Mordecai, and he concocted an evil plot to have him executed. So, those are examples of contending with a person without cause, a person that's done no harm there, taking advantage and manipulating to your advantage and their disadvantage. These verses deal with how we are to relate to our neighbor and naturally give rise to the question of, well, exactly who is my neighbor? Read a sermon by a Baptist preacher named Tim White. He shared this. He said, Haddon Robinson said, your neighbor is anyone whose need you see, whose need you are able to meet. A neighbor is someone who says what's mine is God's, and what's God's belongs to my neighbor because my neighbor belongs to him. In Matthew 25, 31 through 40, when Jesus was telling about the judge honoring those who loved him in his life, one of the things he mentions in verse 25 was, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. When they ask when Jesus was a stranger and they welcomed him, he responds in verse 40, when you did it for the less noticed, least deserving, the most different, the most unlikable, you did it to me. There was a story that circulated a few years ago of a popular high school girl who heard a noise coming from a locker at school. She opened the locker and found a small freshman who some of the bigger guys had put into his locker. She not only freed him from the locker, but she befriended him. And she stopped the bullying in his life. Why? Because that's what Jesus would have done, she said. When they interviewed the boy, they asked him what he had done that turned these bullies against him. What egregious thing did they consider unforgivable and justifiable in being cruel to this boy? He answered as truthfully as he knew how, just being different. The wise father, the wisest man in the world, Solomon, tells his children, don't be evil to people who are different. Do not contend with a man for no reason when he has done you no harm. I saw another sermon on these verses, and Dr. David Hallam outlined these 4 verses this way, and so I think it's a good summation. He says, give what's good, verse 27. Give what's needed when it's needed, verse 28. Give what's wanted, verse 29. And give what is warranted, verse 30. So give what's good, give what's needed when it's needed, give what's wanted, and give what is warranted. Okay, let's look at verses 31 through 35 and see some of the blessings of wisdom as we wind up chapter 3. Do not envy a man of violence, and do not choose any of his ways. For the devious are an abomination to the Lord, but he is intimate with the upright. The curse of the Lord is on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the dwelling of the righteous. Though he scoffs at the scoffers, he gives grace to the afflicted. The wise will inherit honor, but fools display dishonor. The violent man is someone who would hurt another to gain some advantage. And when you think about it, a person can be violent and not be physical. He can gossip, he can cheat, he can steal his way to the top. The psalmist says there's no benefit in feeling envy for the wicked because God detests wickedness. Only a fool would wish to be detestable to God. In verses 32 through 35, we see how 2 distinctly different fates await the wicked and the righteous. And in those 4 verses, note the different words he uses to describe each of these. In verse 32 here, the devious and the upright. Some of your translations will say the perverse. That means someone who chooses the wrong path. And God detests, abhors this kind of person. A word that elsewhere expresses abhorrence of pagan practices and moral abuses. And it's a common word in the book of Proverbs. But the Lord will be close and intimate with a man who treats others right, the upright person. In verse 33, he uses some different terminology. The curse of the Lord is on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the dwelling of the righteous. So here he describes them as wicked and righteous. Verse 34, though he scoffs at the scoffers, yet he gives grace to the afflicted. Scoffers and afflicted. Holman Christian says those who mock and the humble. Here. In verse 35, the wise will inherit honor, but fools display dishonor. So in verse 35, it's the wise and the fools. A preacher named Mike Hayes on these verses said, what does this all mean? We all know people who are not seeking God at all, and yet it seems that things are going well for them. Hold on, my friend, we haven't got to the end of the book yet. Instead of peace, security, and joy, the house of the wicked is filled with chaos, insecurity, and unrest. You may have all the toys in the world and a bulging bank account as well, but never experience the peace, security, and joy that comes when God's hand of blessing is upon you. Don't measure blessings and curses by what one has or doesn't have. Measure God's blessing by who a person is and how at rest they are in their current situation. He says, as I mentioned to you earlier, if you listen to the wisdom of the world, then you'll learn that making more money at any cost is the ultimate goal. It doesn't matter who you step on or how you get it, just get it. God's word stands as a total contradiction to the world's wisdom. God teaches us, shows us, and reminds us to be a blessing, to serve those around us, to defend the helpless, orphans, and widows. The Expositor's Commentary sums up these verses in this way. In dealing with neighbors, one should avoid envying or emulating a violent person. This warning is followed by the reasons expressed in a series of contrasts. On the one hand, the Lord detests the perverse, curses the house of the wicked, mocks proud mockers, and holds fools up to shame. But with the upright he's pleased, blesses their home, gives grace to the humble, and bequeaths honor to the wise. So, wise and upright behavior pleases God and results in his blessing. The Expositor's Commentary there makes reference to the 73rd Psalm. And when I looked at that 73rd Psalm, it seems to me like that it really sums up in words a lot better than I can what we see here in these verses, because it presents this contrast. Listen, I'm just going to read it here. As for me, my feet had almost stumbled. My steps had nearly slipped. For I was envious of the boastful when I saw the prosperity of the wicked. For there are no pangs in their death. Their strength is firm. They're not in trouble as other men, nor are they plagued like other men. Therefore pride serves as their necklace. Violence covers them like a garment. Their eyes bulge with abundance. They have more than heart could wish. They scoff and speak wickedly concerning oppression. They speak loftily. They set their mouth against the heavens, and their tongue walks through the earth. Therefore his people return here, and waters of a full cup are drained by them. And they say, how does God know? And is there knowledge in the Most High? Behold, these are the ungodly, who are always at ease. They increase in riches. Sound familiar? Sometimes it seems that way when we look at those that go their own way. And then he says, surely I have cleansed my heart in vain and washed my hands in innocence. For all day long I've been plagued and chastened every morning. So he says, is all this all that I've tried to do is it in vain? Then he says, if I had said, I will speak thus, behold, I would have been untrue to the generation of your children. When I thought how to understand this, it was too painful for me until I went into the sanctuary of God. Then I understood their end. Surely you set them in slippery places. You cast them down to destruction. Oh, how they are brought to desolation as in a moment. They are utterly consumed with terror, as a dream when one awakes. So, Lord, when you awake, you shall despise their image. Thus my heart was grieved, and I was vexed in my mind. I was so foolish and ignorant. I was like a beast before you. Nevertheless, I am continually with you. You hold me by my right hand. You will guide me with your counsel, and afterward receive me to glory. Whom have I in heaven but you? And there is none upon earth that I desire besides you. My flesh and my heart fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. For indeed those who are far from you shall perish. You have destroyed all those who desert you for harlotry. But it is good for me to draw near to God. I have put my trust in the Lord God, that I may declare all your works. So choose the wisdom of God rather than the wickedness of the world. Next week, we'll move into chapter 4 and talk about choices. So come back next week. Thank you.